Is there anybody seeking the call? Minister.
I table the document Approaches to Senate Estimates Questions on Notice asked of all agencies. It's certainly no secret.
Thank you, Minister. Call Senator Birmingham.
Thanks, Acting Deputy President. I move to take note of the document tabled by the Minister. And Acting Deputy President, the Minister has just tabled the document titled Approaches to Answering Senate Questions. Approaches to answering Senate questions from the government. Now, this should be a pretty simple document. It should be give honest, direct answers. That would be the case if the government were living up to their rhetoric. And the Minister's tabled this document saying that it's no secret. Well, I want to be clear at the outset. The government has only tabled this document because the Senate was about to order it to table this document. And I acknowledge the Greens, as well as the entire Senate crossbench, for the fact that there was unanimous support from non-government senators in this place to call upon the government to table this document and to require the government to explain its contents. Now, in the face of knowing that unanimous support, something we don't often see in this place, from all non-government senators was coming, the government has decided at the last minute to table the document that the Senate was about to force it to table. We, of course, haven't had the chance to review it yet because the document was a secret, Minister, until you just tabled it. But we came to ask for it because the Coalition, the Greens, the Senate crossbench rightly shared in the outrage at revelations about the contents of this document. We shared in the outrage because this is not a document about how to transparently and honestly answer Senate questions. It's a document from the Albanese government about how to dodge and avoid answering Senate questions. It's a document prepared, we don't know for sure, either in the Prime Minister's office or the Prime Minister's department, but certainly with the Prime Minister's stamp on it, that has been circulated out to ministers' offices and/or government departments, giving them advice on how to obfuscate, how to avoid, how to cover up, how to ensure that Senate questions go unanswered rather than answered. The hypocrisy we see from the Labor Party in this regard is quite astounding. The Albanese government was going to be a beacon of transparency, but instead they've come up with their own codified manual on how to cover up their misdeeds and mistakes. I want to give credit to journalists Anthony Galloway and Jennifer Duke from Capital Briefing, who broke this story in the last couple of weeks. They were the ones who got extracts of this manual and were able to publish it. And in publishing it, they brought to the attention of non-government senators the tactics of the government, for which I think we'd all been somewhat curious as we saw more and more consistent responses coming to questions, responses that didn't go remotely close to answering them. So although we've only just had the document tabled by the government, let's take a close look at some of the examples in what the journalists have published to date about what is in this document. For example, if a question says, has the department or agency held any organised external retreats or external speakers? Suggested draft response. Now, you might think the suggested response would be yes or no, provide details, but no, the suggested draft response is the data requested is not captured centrally and obtaining it would be an unreasonable diversion of resources. Too bad if the person drafting the response was sitting at an external retreat last weekend.
Absolutely. Peppers, no less, I'm sure.
They should actually full well know that that external retreat happened and be able to report upon it. But no, the recommendation is to say, oh, that would be too hard to answer, therefore we cannot answer it. What about if a question were asked about the number of meetings a secretary or agency head has with ministers in their portfolio over a defined period of time? The suggested draft response from the Albanese government about interactions between their ministers and their agency heads. The Secretary regularly meets with portfolio ministers and, at times, ministers outside the portfolio. No answer at all. This is the best of yes, Minister. This document must have been drafted by somebody sitting down in the Prime Minister's office, getting out the old VCR recorder, putting in their old highlights from Yes Minister and going, "Oh, this is what Sir Humphrey would have said." Because that seems to be the approach the government's taking. How many meetings there might have been, the Secretary regularly meets with the portfolio ministers. What is the minimum processing time for consideration of briefs by the minister? The department prepares briefs within agreed timeframes on a case-by-case basis, avoiding detail at every possible opportunity.
About this one. Transparency alert.
Transparency alert.
Senator Cash.
There is no.
I'm all excited at the transparency alert.
Senator Cash,
we see
I
very
urge you to
little by
contain
way
your
of
excitement.
transparency in this document
Senator
or in
Birmingham,
relation.
you have the call.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. What really strikes me is when we come to very precise questions about things, for example, to do with budget transparency. And this is very relevant. Today is budget day. We are going into the 2-week budget estimates period after this Senate sitting week. And a very focused, precise question would be, for the portfolio, please provide a list of the 10 largest estimate variations in the most recent financial year. You don't get much more precise than that. It's a specific question, specific to the budget, time limited to the last financial year on a particular issue, namely estimates variations, where a government department has changed during the course of a year how much they think they're going to spend on a particular item. So you should absolutely be able to table precisely what those estimates variations are. What is the Albanese government's secret little manual on how to not answer questions suggesting as a response to this very precise statement? Quote, "The portfolio additional estimate statements inform the Parliament of changes to the total resources available for an entity since the budget. The Pays Annual Appropriations Bills No. 3 and 4 and Appropriation Parliamentary Departments Bill No. 2 are tabled in the Parliament usually in February each year." End quote. So, when senators, whether it is a coalition senator, a Greens senator, Senator Babet, or any other member of the crossbench, go and ask a precise and detailed budget question of the Albanese Labor government, what do they get fed in return? A bunch of bureaucratic jargon referring them to go and try to work it out from the budget papers themselves. Information that won't actually be in those budget papers. You will not find, in the detail that is requested, the information the government is referring you to go and find in the budget papers. They're setting senators up to run around in little circles like a dog chasing its tail, never actually getting the answer. That's the type of contempt we are seeing from the Albanese government when it comes to how it's treating the Senate, when it comes to transparency issues, when it comes to the approach to estimates. And what is so galling? What is so galling, Acting Deputy President, is that this is a government who made so much about these issues in opposition. In 2022, Mr Albanese said, "The Australian people deserve accountability and transparency, not secrecy." Well, this is the complete opposite of what Mr Albanese promised. He has actually taken lack of transparency, lack of accountability and government secrecy to a whole new level. The Prime Minister's office is directing, in a manual, government departments on how to avoid answering questions. You couldn't come up with a more precise example of the opposite of transparency. It's a scandal. The fact the government, rather than coming in here apologising and saying we're going to instruct our departments to ignore this and we got it wrong, instead comes in here and says it's no secret and there's nothing to hide, shows just how arrogant they are, just how out of touch they are, and just how willing they are to break every single promise or commitment they made to the Australian people.
Thank you, Senator Birmingham. Minister.
Acting Deputy President, and Senator Birmingham is right about one thing. We did make a big issue about this in opposition, and there's a reason for that. Exhibit A is right there, Senator McKenzie. Exhibit B is right there, Senator Cash, when it comes to avoiding questions at Senate estimates. We saw it all the time. He sat in the cabinet table with the former Prime Minister who appointed himself to 5 ministries. Five ministries. What did he do about it? So we absolutely made a big deal about this because the Australian people demanded us to make a big deal about it because they were sick of it. They were absolutely sick of it and the way they were being treated by the previous government. So when they come in here, and it was a fine performance from Senator Birmingham, but they've got a record. They've got a record of being in government that we remember, and the Australian people remember, more importantly, that we have a big task to overcome. So that is why we absolutely highlighted these in opposition, and we're proud of our record in government of actually turning this around. And the Australian people know they can expect us to be transparent and honest and accountable on every occasion with them, unlike those opposite from what we've seen. So the Albanese government is delivering a higher standard of integrity, transparency and accountability, and we're upholding a standard the opposition never, ever did. The Albanese government has reversed Australia's decade-long slide by lifting the country's ranking on Transparency International's annual corruption perception index from 18 to 13.
Senator Birmingham.
This didn't happen by accident. We have established the National Anti-Corruption Commission, another thing they talked about for years but did nothing, strengthened the Ministerial Code of Conduct, strengthened protections for whistleblowers, increased funding for the ANAO, restored transparency to AAT appointments, reinstated a standalone Privacy and FOI Commissioner, and implemented the Bell Inquiry recommendation in less than 2 years. We've done all of that in less than 2 years, more than they did in a decade. The number of Senate estimates questions on notice, parliamentary questions on notice and orders for production of documents have all skyrocketed in the 47th parliament. Despite this surge, the Albanese government is on track to answer more questions than any previous government. They don't like hearing about it, do they? They actually don't like hearing about a government with integrity and accountability and a record of delivering on this. The Albanese government is on track to answer more questions on notice than any previous government. As of the 13th of May 2024, less than 0.1% of questions on notice remain unanswered from the first 4 rounds of Senate estimates in the 47th parliament, with work continuing to respond to the mammoth number of questions received in the most recent round. The number of questions has skyrocketed, and it's important we consider whether answering all of them are the best use of public sector resources. An example of a few that have come through to just the PMC alone.
Enough.
Which floor is the Secretary's office on compared to that of the Prime Minister when the Prime Minister is working in that city? That's a question that they've put on notice. What planning is underway in case of the King's death?
Senator Chisholm, I'll have to ask you to resume your seat. A document was requested. It has been provided. The minister is speaking to it. The response to the tabling of that document by Senator Birmingham was listened to with respect. I have called individual senators by name. You are out of order. You are out of order. I call on you to respect the standing orders of the Senate and allow the minister to respond. You have the call, Minister.
Thanks, Acting Deputy President. And Senator Birmingham's not immune from this frivolous activity as well. Senator Birmingham asked what temperature the department's buildings are currently set at. Senator Hume alone has asked 13,000 questions on notice in this term. That includes 331 questions concerning paper use by departments, 125 questions on working on the King's birthday and other public holiday, and 31 questions concerning who might be the longest-serving agency member. The government wants the public service focused on answering questions that are in the public interest, not spurious questions seemingly written to waste the resources of the public sector. We are working across government to support efficient, timely responses to questions on notice. That is our record, and that is what we're doing. So, despite receiving nearly half the number of questions estimates round as the Albanese government, the Liberals failed to answer 360 questions on notice when they left office, some dating back as far as October 2019. The Liberals failed to answer nearly 780 questions on notice by the time they left office in May 2022, some many years overdue, despite receiving far fewer questions on average, 86 a month versus 138 a month. Over the life of the previous government, this equals an average unanswered question rate of 8.2%, significantly higher than the Albanese government's rate of 1.4%. But as I pointed out, it is important to remind the Australian people. I think they remember, I'm confident they remember, but it's always worth reminding them of the record of those opposite when their decade in power and the work that we had to do to overcome so much damage they had done to accountability and transparency in this country. The former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, secretly appointed himself to 5 ministerial positions without the knowledge of the public or his own government or some of the people, the ministers he appointed himself to. Then Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton refused to appear before an inquiry into allegations he misused his ministerial powers to intervene in 2 separate cases to allow a French au pair and an Italian au pair into the country. According to the committee's final report in September 2018, it should be noted that on 29 August 2018, the committee extended an invitation to the Honourable Peter Dutton, the Minister for Home Affairs, to appear at the hearing. The committee received no response. After repeatedly denying that either she or her office had tipped off the media ahead of a 2017 police raid on the AWU officers on behalf of the Registered Organisations Committee, then Employment Minister Senator Cash was forced to admit one of her staffers had in fact done so. Senator Cash then refused to provide a witness statement to the AFP in their subsequent investigation. Senator Mackenzie only gave evidence to us inquiry into sports frauds after the Senate forced her to do so.
Senator Chisholm, sorry, I have to respond to, I'm assuming, a point of order. What is the point of order?
That's right, Acting Deputy
Senator
President. Personal reflection. The accusation made against...
I note that. Can I just ask the Minister to withdraw the personal reflection?
I withdraw.
Thank you. Please continue.
Senator Mackenzie gave evidence to an inquiry into sports frauds only after the Senate forced her to do so. The Select Committee on Administration of Sports Grants had previously requested Senator Mackenzie appear as a witness on no less than 6 occasions, but she declined every time. The Coalition voted against a motion requiring Senator Mackenzie's appearance by the inquiry. The Shadow Treasurer, Mr Taylor, as Energy and Emissions Reduction Minister, changed the law to keep secret electricity price hikes ahead of the 2022 election and deliberately concealed from the public and the energy market construction delays and hefty cost blowouts on the Snowy 2.0 project. Then Environment Minister Susan Ley suppressed the State of the Environment report ahead of the 2022 election because it revealed the Liberals and Nationals' environmental performance was even worse than feared. And of course there's the gold standard of integrity and accountability, Barnaby Joyce. And he has a long record of disgrace when it comes to these issues. He was appointed the Special Envoy for Drought Assistance and Drought Recovery by the former Prime Minister Morrison, and he spent almost $1 million of taxpayers' money in 9 months, spent less than 3 weeks in drought-affected communities and didn't produce a report behind a text message to the Prime Minister, which was, of course, kept secret. So when they come in here to talk about these issues, it is important that we remind people about their record in government. So they have absolutely no credibility to stand on when they accuse this government, which has a proud record in the 2 years we've been here, of restoring integrity and accountability. It's one that the Australian people understand. They still judge those opposite harshly. They've shown no remorse for their actions in government, and we will absolutely remind the Australian people every opportunity we get of their diabolical record, and the Australian people treated them accordingly.
Thank you, Senator Chisholm. I call the Leader of the Greens, Senator Waters.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. Well, it's very rare that the Greens, the entire crossbench and the Coalition agree on something. Now, answering questions at estimates is not optional, but it appears like this government would like it to be. We know from leaks of a document distributed by the Prime Minister's office to ministerial officers in recent weeks, providing advice on how to avoid answering questions in estimates. Just a few choice quotes from Capital Brief. This document urges everyone to consider referring questions to another department or agency, where appropriate, and tells them to provide only information required to answer the question. In the document, departments and agencies are also advised to avoid answering a question about how many external retreats or speakers they've organised. Instead, they should respond with, "The data requested is not captured centrally, and obtaining it would be an unreasonable diversion of resources." When asked how many meetings their secretary has had with ministers, departments are advised to respond, "The Secretary regularly meets with portfolio ministers and at times ministers outside the portfolio." End quote. Now, we had an earnest defence by Senator Chisholm, but that cannot overcome the fact that this is a Prime Minister's Office instruction manual on how to avoid giving meaningful answers in Senate estimates. And we only know of it because someone with ethics and concern for democracy leaked part of this document last week, which of course led to all non-government senators tabling a motion asking the government to disclose the full document, and also asking the Prime Minister's representative to come in and give an account of themselves. Now, about 5 seconds before that was meant to happen, the government in fact tabled a copy of the document, but it's very embarrassing that that took the threat of this motion for them to do so. It's very embarrassing for the government that they didn't fess up and do this of their own volition, and it took the rest of the chamber to force them to do the right thing. Now, I've had a quick squeeze through the full document. I don't know whether it's been altered. I don't know if that is in fact the original document, so we will scrutinise that very closely. But the second part of the motion that was going to be moved required Senator Wong to attend and explain what the actual is going on. We called on the government to say who wrote this document, who ticked off on this document, and who was sent this document. Now, none of that has happened today in the government's hasty tabling of what they say is the full version of this cheat sheet on how to not answer questions in estimates. So we still don't know the extent of knowledge that the Prime Minister himself had over this entire debacle document. What we do know is that the PMO is saying the quiet bit out loud. They clearly don't want to answer questions or provide transparent information about their decisions or their policies. Now, the Prime Minister should immediately retract this document. The Senate standing orders make it an offence for a witness to refuse to answer a question unless they make a valid claim of public interest immunity, so questions in Senate estimates are meant to be answered. So much for the transparency and accountability that this Labor Party promised in government. This document does not provide advice that is consistent with that commitment, that the Australian people deserve accountability and transparency, not secrecy. If the Prime Minister wants to live up to that commitment to transparency, he should immediately, today, retract this document. In recent estimates, it has been getting harder and harder to get answers to questions, and detailed answers at that, and it is not acceptable from any government, but particularly not from a government that said they would be better on transparency and accountability. And I want to flag that the author of this document, which we don't know who it is because it doesn't have a name on the tabled version, the author of this document could be in contempt of the Senate. Now, we don't know if the Prime Minister wrote this document or if the Prime Minister authorised this document. There's an argument that the Prime Minister could be in contempt of the Senate. Privileges Resolution number 6 says a person should not improperly interfere with the free exercise by the Senate or a committee of its authority. And it further talks about offences by witness. A witness before the Senate or a committee shall not, without reasonable excuse, refuse to answer any relevant question put to the witness when required to do so, or shall not give evidence which the witness knows to be false or misleading in a material particular, or which the witness does not believe on reasonable grounds to be true or substantially true in every material particular. Now, I think you can mount an argument that this document is instructing departmental officials to breach those rules and is therefore instructing departmental officials to be in contempt of the Senate. This is a cheat sheet on how to mislead senators in estimates, And it's the Prime Minister showing absolute disregard for the process of open democracy, and he's trashing his own so-called promise for more accountability and transparency. I reiterate that the Prime Minister should retract this document today and start delivering on their promise of a more accountable and transparent government, because this is a betrayal by the Labor government of their promises for a better government, and at this point they're just Scott Morrison in a different coloured tie.
Are you seeking the call on this matter, Senator Roberts? You have the call.
Thank you. I speak to this motion to take note. I have yet to read the document in full and in detail, yet its existence is very disturbing, as other speakers have already said. At Senate estimates, Anthony Albanese's office is putting words in the mouth of department heads. How can we trust their answers? We cannot trust this government. Repeatedly we get suppression of democracy. Repeatedly. And we're seeing arrogance. So let's have a look at some data, and then I'll come back to talking more about this document. As of the end of December 2023, the 7th of December specifically, after 94 Senate sitting days in the 47th Parliament, that's Anthony Albanese's Parliament, guillotine motions agreed to 14. Under the previous Morrison government in the 46th Parliament, guillotine motions agreed to 14. Now we start seeing the difference. Total number of bills subjected to guillotine in the 47th Parliament under the Labor, Greens, Teal-Pocock coalition, led by Anthony Albanese, 87 bills subject to guillotine. In the 46th Parliament under the Morrison Liberals, 59. So we see almost 50% more in this government under the coalition that they have formed with Senator Pocock, Greens and Labor, and sometimes, quite often, Jackie Lambie's support. Promised transparency and accountability. Instead, we get repeated suppression of democracy. Repeatedly. Arrogance. That's what we say it is, arrogance. We see that suppression of democracy is a form of control. Always beneath control, there is fear. Of what is the Albanese Labor, Greens, Teals, Pocock coalition afraid? Afraid of truth, Madam Acting Deputy President, afraid of truth. Afraid fundamentally of an informed citizenry. They don't want people to know. Now the media has seen copies of the Prime Minister's, the PMO's secret manual on sidestepping Senate estimates questions. That's the headline. Capital Brief, I'll quote from there. Capital Brief has seen a document sent by Anthony Albanese's office advising departments on how to handle questions on notice from Senate estimates. Current and former senators say the edict represents contempt of the Senate. Contempt of the Senate is a very serious matter. Another article. Current and former senators, lawyers and a former top judge have said the drafting of the document could result in contempt of the Senate. Contempt of the Senate. Anthony Albanese's office has stood by, another quote, by a document it issued to Senate senior bureaucrats which advised them how to sidestep Senate estimates questions on the basis that inquiries have skyrocketed. Well, that's your job. I don't care if they've skyrocketed. We'll keep asking questions since Labor came to government. I'll get to the Prime Minister's office manual, what we've seen of it so far. I haven't dissected it. When the interests of several departments, this is a quote, are involved, the government guidelines for official witnesses before parliamentary committees and related matters call for departments to consult with other departments as part of the drafting process. This includes instances where the same or similar Senate estimates questions on notice are asked of all or multiple departments and agencies. Why are you worried about different answers from different departments? Look at some of the topics covered. Well, we'll go through that another time. One Nation normally, I know this is not a motion by leave to seek a variation of standing orders, but we normally oppose them because the Senate should be focused firstly on Senate responsibilities, and secondly, the Senate should be focused on government business. We want the government to govern. Senate estimates, though, are a vital part of holding governments and bureaucrats accountable for taxpayer funds. Why do you hide from that? Why do you hide from that? Anthony Albanese's department wants to hide the truth from the people. We have seen the Fair Work Commission and Fair Work Ombudsman stumbling through my answer to questions, attempting to get to the bottom of their complicity with the CFMEU and major multinational labour hire firms, stealing $30,000 to $40,000 per miner each year from thousands of casual miners in central Queensland and the Hunter Valley. They hide the facts wilfully. The Fair Work Ombudsman Office relies on fraud repeatedly. The Labor Minister for Workplace Relations ignores and diverts. It's embarrassing for departments. We look forward to reviewing the formerly secret document in detail because democracy is at stake.
Thank you. The question is that the Senate take note of the document provided by the Minister. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the clerk.